Hey everyone, Puneet here. Welcome to episode 15 of the North of Patient podcast, Conversations on Health Beyond Care. Today's guest is someone whose work truly defies categorization. Amy Karle is an internationally acclaimed ultra-contemporary artist, designer, and futurist whose work explores the deep connections between technology, healing, and the future of human evolution. Amy's journey is both extraordinary and deeply personal. Born with a life-threatening condition, she grew up immersed in the world of science and medicine. That early experience didn't just shape her, it set her on a lifelong path to explore how emerging technologies like AI and biotechnology can be used not just to heal, but to reimagine what it means to be human altogether. Her work has been exhibited all over the world and even sent to space quite recently. In this episode, we'll explore some of her most boundary-pushing projects, from bioprinted bone scaffolds to a new archive of life being stored on the moon. Amy also shares her insights into the role of generative AI in healthcare, the risks of data opacity, and why she believes that true innovation requires us to stay grounded in empathy, ethics, and the human story. Without further ado, here is episode 15, Amy Karle. Amy, so excited to have this conversation with you. I've been waiting for this chat for quite a while, and I was thrilled when you responded to my initial message. And I feel like there's a bit of a funny story around that message itself. Because you'd asked me, how did I come across your website? How did I come across your work? It was actually ChatGPT, where I was looking at, I was feeding guests and conversations I'd had before. I was feeding it the nature of the goal of the podcast. And right at the top of the list, your name came up and said, this is the person to speak to at the intersection of technology, art, humanity, and health. And so I'm just super grateful that you have an opportunity to be here and for us to have this chat.
Well, thanks for reaching out. And I think that's really a telling story to consider. Oftentimes we think of our current wave of Gen AI as like single user, but it is connecting us. And we're having now new ways of connecting with each other too. So I think this is actually one of the more beautiful uses of our technology. So it's interesting to hear that's how we met.
Absolutely. And, I had such a wonderful time reading about the immense portfolio of work that you've done. And, I feel like likely not going to have enough time to go through all of it, to do justice to all of it, but I'll make sure that people have a link where they can dive into more about your work. But perhaps you can start right at the beginning, before we kind of get to your work at the intersection of a number of these spaces. uh, Maybe just tell me a little bit about what it was like growing up. Where did you grow up, and what was that journey like?
So I was born in upstate New York in Endicott, kind of a small town. My parents were pharmacists and biochemists, and I was born with a life-threatening birth defect, aplasia cutis. I was missing a large amount of skin and bone on my head. The doctors didn't think I would live, thought I would be mentally disabled. If I did live, thought I would have to live in a bubble. I mean, when you're missing a big part of your skin and bone in your skull, like you're very vulnerable. But my parents were determined to take care of me. And so this actually really shaped my life trajectory, my life journey, because most people don't have to face some of these kinds of issues until they're much older, until a loved one gets sick and passes away, oftentimes like maybe a grandparent or somebody has an illness themselves, or even when they're coming into understanding their own sexuality and maybe not feeling like themselves in their body. But I had to deal with this from a very young age. So there's a lot of understanding the limitations of the body and like what are our capabilities within that. But then there was also this hope in medical technology because my parents were in the field. They were really great at being able to seek out the best medical experts and the latest in science and technology to try to heal me. And I finally did have a surgery that closed my skin at the Mayo Clinic when I was a teenager after many experimental surgeries that did not work. My skull is still open. And I watched them like seek out what is the latest in healthcare that can heal and enhance the body, that can save us. But then I also saw through that where that limit was. So even if we could make those changes, life-saving changes to heal our body, what does it mean to heal the human aspect? What are all the other arenas that we carry with us that are part of that healing journey as well? So that really shaped the trajectory of all of the work that I do and really my life's passion and my life's work. But I work as an artist because this is the way that I communicate the best and tell these stories and do my research the best.
That's incredible. And it's not surprising that obviously it's had a profound impact on your life and the way that you see things. Obviously, so glad to hear that things ended in a positive direction. Out of curiosity, just 'cause I'm not as familiar with this condition myself, and I was looking into it a little bit prior to this conversation. But is there a community of people that have survived from this that you were able to tap into? Has there been some connection in that form? I guess similar to things like Patients Like Me or other forums?
No, not that I know of. So now with advanced genetic testing in recent years, I have contributed to studies on this, on aplasia cutis. So when I was young, all the known cases that had it to the degree that I had it had passed away, and a number of them had limb differences as well. Now, I don't have any measurable limb differences. My toes are really small. They're always measuring my toes to see, like, do you actually have a limb difference, or are they just tiny feet? But, there's some characteristics that, may be hereditary, may not. We really don't know. But through doing the studies, I did learn that there is a family that has survived, that has it, where the whole family has it. And, but I
Nice.
haven't been able to connect with them because I didn't do my own independent research into it. And of course, like going in through a medical environment, doing genetic testing, that wouldn't be revealed of who they actually were. Likewise, I'm open in sharing this widely, like sharing my story, sharing the name of it. So if other people are interested and wanted to get in touch with me, they could, but it's pretty rare. And so people have not gotten in touch with me. And then I've also heard of cases where there's a small region of skin, like a quarter size or smaller, so that can close up. We don't know if that's in the family or not, or in this grouping, but I have not connected with that community. Although I'm always very touched and inspired that through my art, a community with disabilities and other medical conditions always approaches me and will say, like, hey, thank you for bringing this up in your work and talking about that so openly, and we have some connection even if we don't share the same underlying condition. There's a shared understanding and a shared knowing of how these experiences shape us through our lives.
Yeah, I can imagine. And, I think it also begs the interesting question around, because I can only assume that you've had many interactions with the healthcare system where quite likely you knew more about the condition than the healthcare provider that you're talking to, which is often the lived experience for people with rare conditions, rare diseases. And I wonder if, how going through this journey would be different for somebody, obviously, today relative to several years ago in terms of the availability and accessibility of that of information online and obviously through generative tools as well.
Because and again, this like comes back to my parents, and I have to give them so much credit. At the time, I was born in 1980, and at that time, the way of how we get information and how we share information was very different. And I have a copy of all my old medical records and all these letters. My parents went to Columbia University, and all their correspondence back and forth with the library of, like, trying to find who's doing the research, who's doing the latest research, where that could be applicable, contacting the different medical institutions. In that way, we have gone so far. And they're my mom's, like, old typewritten letters where I can, like, see the indentations from the typewriter that she was using. Like, now we can look that up online in a matter of hours, right? I'm not gonna say minutes because it does take a little bit more research than that to find the right places, but just like the time that it was spent and the missed connections that now we have access to is amazing. But also there's something that's happening now that there's so much information that it's easy to get lost like a needle in a haystack, that I think wasn't such an issue before, where when my parents reached out, they got a response. And now
Yep.
it's really hard to get through to like, there's some appointments I've been trying to make at our major medical system here that, insurance is already approved and everything. And they're just like, we can't even put you on a list for 2 years out.
Wow.
So, we're seeing these shifts in accessibility and medicine that some ways are really improving. In some ways we have these ongoing challenges and new challenges.
I think you've touched on two topics that right off the bat have been huge drivers for myself in my own entrepreneurial journey. One has been this idea of like an overwhelming amount of information and misinformation, disinformation, and just
Well,
generally how do you navigate when there's just so much out there. And it's funny because we think about generative AI, ChatGPT, and related tools as potentially being an answer, and now we're quickly finding ourselves in a world where you have multiple different agents and chatbots to talk to, and now you have the work of going through the different agents, and they all give you slightly different responses. So we've replaced noise of one kind with noise of another kind. And so that's been one thing it's really driven a lot of what I'm doing in my current journey. And that other piece is obviously also accessibility, which remains a challenge, despite the fact that we obviously have so much expenditure on healthcare and we have so much talent. Connecting people with the right information, the right type of service is still such a challenge. It's incredible. Um,
I'd actually
yeah,
like
and
to comment on that too. And I think another area that we need to improve and safeguard is once there is a mistake in the system now, it is immensely hard to correct. And it is carried across all of our records, all of our providers. And it is so difficult to modify. And then it continues to affect our care and health journey, whether it's a lack of information or a mistake. Um, and I witnessed that like myself, and I hear a lot of other people complain about that as well. The amount of difficulty it is to actually correct something that is an error in the system is difficult. And now as we further engage with our technologies that are less and less transparent, like AI, it becomes much more difficult to ensure that we are getting the care that is properly tailored to what we need. So we have all these amazing opportunities to get that kind of tailored,
yeah,
patient-centric, patient-specific care. But then also, if there is a problem or opacity, like if a young woman like myself, a younger woman, almost middle-aged woman with a heart condition goes into the cardiologist, and that cardiologist is using advanced tools like AI, it's comparing me to 70-plus-year-old white men. So it's just going to say
yeah,
nothing's wrong. And this is another area where it's like, we need to make sure that there's the transparency, because if there is an error, if there is a mistake, how do we have a human checkpoint to make sure that's being corrected? If there is a lack of transparency, how do we know what data we're being compared to and measured against to truly assess our conditions and properly diagnose?
yeah. There's an incredible amount of work to do there,
Mhm.
and I worked in the EMR industry for over 10 years, and I'm very familiar with the complexity that lies around there in terms of what is the truth about a person.
Mhm.
One place in some emergency record, it might say the person's a smoker. The other place it says lifetime non-smoker. What's real? And does the person even know that there's this discrepancy there? And
So
most of the time they don't, right? There's been well-documented studies that have talked about how such a large fraction of patient records have erroneous information. And in many cases, that information can have negative impacts on people's health. So it's a really big problem. And now things are evolving even faster on data. And the question is how valid is that data even for that one
Mhm.
person? So kind of going back a little bit to your experience with having a rare disease that had significant impact on your life, was there a specific moment that you can think back to where you were kind of like, this is going to be a part of what I end up doing in the future, or was it a much more torturous journey that sort of led you to where you are? And how does one become a ultra contemporary artist and many of the things that you're doing?
I can say that there was one specific moment of knowing, like, this is going to be my life journey. It's usually in our looking back that we can more clearly track our path. For me, it's more been a consistent driving force and a consistent driving passion of how do we heal and enhance our bodies as individuals and then like as a larger species? How do we enhance our trajectory? How do we have a better future? And when you start to ask those questions, it opens the door for a lot more questions. And in my path I mentioned earlier is through art because that is the way that I communicate the best. That's the way that I learn the best as well, experientially, visually. It's also the way that I communicate and connect with others the best. Like I might be asking all of these very, very complex questions about how technologies can impact the future of humanities, like how generative AI and bioprinting and doing all of this work together of this time of infotech and biotech coming together. I could write a book on that or give a speech that's a few hours long, or in one instant, make an artwork that when you walk by that or experience it in the museum, like you kind of just get it in an instant. So I've kind of always known that I communicate and connect best as an artist. And I have always had this passion for looking at how our technologies can heal and enhance us. What are the opportunities in that? Also, what are the pitfalls too, though? Like not to ignore that dynamic range. If we're going to work towards preferable outcomes, we need to know the full range of what we want to move towards and what we need to improve on. So as I've continued to work, that has developed further and further and has taken me on an interesting trajectory because of the opportunities that are before me. So you were asking too, how does one become an ultra contemporary artist? So we define ultra contemporary because I'm using tools that are only accessible. Like right now, I'm using emerging and exponential technologies to consider what does it mean to be human? What does it mean to be alive at this time that we have technologies that are redefining what it means to be alive and what it means to be human? How do we dive into that? How do I really research that? And I use the tools that I'm questioning and I'm making artwork in that process. Oh, I'm making artifacts really, or experiences. So my work if it's like a sculpture, can kind of be seen in a way as this like artifact of a speculative future. I'm asking a question about how could we heal and enhance humanity in the future. I'm using these cutting edge technology and tools. And what I make in the process is a visual show of this research. But that in that too, I see that there's opportunities for doing something better. So a lot of my work also involves speaking, working with companies to redesign the tools towards a more preferable outcome. I do some work in advocacy as well and with think tanks too, because it's kind of this whole end-to-end solution of once you start to see the impacts that these technologies can have, there's a responsibility with that as well of how can these improve us. So my work over the years has developed quite organically of getting different opportunities to be able to engage this kind of work. I live and work in San Francisco, Silicon Valley, because we have the tech companies here that are developing these cutting edge biotech tools. They have the labs, they have the resources. Often by time it gets to other institutions, it's much later. So if I want to really be working with these, I have to go to the source of where it's being developed. And then there's a lot of just like asking very nicely and convincingly of like, hey, this is why this is important. Can we do this work together?
Yeah. And we just missed one another. As I mentioned before, I was in San Francisco for a couple months and, the stars hadn't aligned at that time, but I completely agree with you. I think that there is something kind of magnetic about the space, about just the amount of concentration of work that's happening and the thinking that results from that in terms of how do you solve global problems? How do you solve problems that expand beyond the scope of the planet as well? And in terms of art and its specific role in here, and I have one kind of anecdotal story that I'll insert here as well, and then I'll ask you about receptivity of art in a lot of these domains. But one experience I had in medical school, actually it was in residency at McMaster, was where they exposed, it was I guess, a research project, but the idea was to expose a subset of family medicine residents that were going through training to fine art, and particularly to give them language and training on how to appraise fine art. And the idea was to try to hone skills around perception and around emotion and around being able to read other people and understand different perspectives. It was really neat, and obviously it's outside of the orthodox view, which is often the case with McMaster, in terms of how you do things. And I thought it was a very fresh take, and especially in a world where a lot of the diagnostic thinking and a lot of the reasoning and a lot of the memory related work is going to increasingly be outsourced or partnered in technology. Humans are going to be left to a lot of the softer skills, the empathy, the ability to read, and the ability to be able to project. And I guess my question for you, extending from here, would be: um, did you find that there was generally receptivity on the other end, whether it was in health sciences or other fields, to the role of art in these spaces, or were you trying to have to convince people of that case?
My responsibility isn't about convincing of the art. My responsibility is about convincing of the findings of this is how these technologies can impact us, positive and more often negative. Like, hey, pay attention. This is important. And the artwork is a great way to get people to pay attention. So
Absolutely.
I would like to answer your question. But first, I really need to say it's the message that's the more important thing to pay attention to, not the medium.
Mhm.
So, for the people that are listening and hungry for this message, my artwork is exceptionally well received. And there's a lot of museums and cultural institutions, companies around the world that are very excited for this message, because also my message too isn't all doom and gloom. Like, I'm presenting this entire spectrum, but then me as a person am also saying, how do we then work towards that preferable future? This is one way I can do it. But as your company, as your institution, as you, it's like in healthcare, what can you do? What is your role in shaping, working towards that better future? And so ultimately, I have a pretty positive message in a landscape that can sometimes be grim.
Yep.
But when you work in it pretty deeply, you see all of these potentials. For the artwork, there's some inherent challenges. And I also, we're focusing on artwork, but I also am a designer too. Like, I was trained in the Bauhaus method, which is very art and design focused. And I kind of see this on an art and a continuum where art is more personal. It's more about sharing the feelings, the emotions, the experiences. And design gives us the access in, or like the framework of how to reach that next step or reach that goal of that preferable future. So there's different audiences for both and different needs for both. For the artwork, there is an art market. And there is an institutional and museum interest in what I do, because these are important stories of our times. And this is where it's ultra contemporary, because you could only have a living artist doing that right now. Like, you can't have, I'm not competing with all of the people in their archives that have passed away. This is something that's new. It's an issue we're facing right now. And in that way, that's something that art has always addressed, is like these emotions, this telling of the future, this canary in a coal mine, showing what can happen to humanity and these shared experiences of humanity as well. So I haven't had to do a lot of convincing, but it does get difficult sometimes, because some of my artwork is bioart. It includes living materials. And those are very tough conditions to engage, to continue and show publicly. Some of these works are really fragile in a laboratory setting, not to mention let's bring them into a museum and try to show it for 6 months. So
Yeah.
so I wouldn't say that's a little bit of a different realm than convincing, but that's
Yep.
definitely a challenge in the art world and for collectors. Like, how do we continue to engage this kind of ultra contemporary medium? We don't know how to necessarily do that in the art world. it's challenging alone in the medical and scientific environment. So in the art world, it's much more difficult.
Yes, a number of things I wanted to unpack there that I think would be really interesting for listeners. One of the things you mentioned, and not everyone listening may be familiar with this, but in terms of the Bauhaus School of Design, is it, and maybe you can ensure that I'm describing it correctly, but is the philosophy behind that the function leads to form? Is that an appropriate way to describe it, or how would you describe
Yeah.
the Bauhaus
No,
School
I
of
should
Design?
actually just maybe speak about where I studied, which was Alfred University. And this is historically a ceramics school, and they helped start Corning. Many in our audience may be familiar with Corning.
Yep.
And there's a material science school there and an art and design school there. And they historically work together. And I think the ceramics school, we'll have to double check this, but I think they compete for the #1 ceramics school in the world. And the ceramic engineering school is quite successful as well. And it's just these two schools of thought, like out in the middle of nowhere. And so it's this art science mindset informing each other. And the art school is under the Bauhaus tradition, which is form follows function, heavily a craft school of make sure all of the work is tight. But then we have this scientific mindset as well. And when you're engaging with ceramics, traditional sculpture, this is very scientific, like making the glazes, making everything come together. So when we look at my work, people would be maybe surprised to know that I was trained traditionally as like a ceramic sculptor, but people that maybe know a little bit more and can look into that would understand how the materiality, the material science, and then like also the fine craftsmanship, the attention to detail, like all of that goes into my work.
That's very interesting, and it's probably an interesting segue to begin to talk a little bit about biodesign and bioart and how these things connect in the context of the health experience. But uh, in terms of your influences beyond personal experience, would you say science fiction, certain artists, were there certain domains that influenced you in your thinking about the future and the future in relation to health?
I think that also goes back to my childhood. So I was raised in Endicott, New York, I mentioned, which is the home of IBM. And growing up, I
Okay.
went to all these school field trips where we would go to rooms filled with computers that were like this. This is a standing image processor, by
Yeah.
the way, a vintage analog computer. We were told stories about, when we were the age we are now, I'm 44, that we would be able to have all of that computing power in the like size of our palm and done. And that the computers and the computing power would be able to tackle our biggest challenges of the world of humanity. They'd be able to solve world hunger, balance international economy, solve all these problems. And we would be able to live lives of leisure and enjoy the arts and do volunteering work, spend time with our families. This was the story that was like painted for us. And I still have that very romantic notion of technology. We have used the technology. We have achieved that level of technology to be able to do those things. But as humans, we haven't made those decisions with that technology. And so that's really informed my perspective quite a bit as well. It's not necessarily healthcare related, but when you couple that mindset with growing up witnessing the potentials of what technology and medicine can do for us, that's really the basis of a lot of my influence.
Gotcha. I can imagine sort of the impact that that would have experientially growing up in that environment. So, in terms of some of your specific works, and there was quite an incredible portfolio that I had an opportunity to go through on your website, and I'll encourage listeners to have a look there as well. There's one project that caught my eye. It was called Regenerative Reliquary.
Mhm.
Uh, can you talk a little bit about that one and how this ties into the idea of regenerative medicine today?
Regenerative Reliquary is a bioart piece, a biodesign piece. This piece is made of generatively bioprinted scaffolds that allow human stem cells to grow into bone over time. So let me break that down a little bit. The piece is made from a custom-made pegged hydrogel that mimics the spongy part of bone or the trabecular structure of bone. So I was thinking about people that need transplants and bone grafts, and even myself having this hole in my skull. Like, we're at this absolutely amazing and pivotal time in medicine where we can see these futures that we could potentially grow replacement parts or bioprint and trigger to grow replacement parts. We've already done so much in modern medicine to be able to do transplants. And bioprinting is an area for me that just is so exciting and disruptive, right? Modern medicine has done an amazing job of keeping us alive to a whole human lifespan. But when I think about the potentials of being able to make replacement parts and replacement organs, could this potentially lead us to a longer lifespan than a human lifespan? Like, we don't know. It brings about a lot of great questions, though. And I had a friend, very close friend, Lisa Ione, that I grew up with, and Lisa had a double lung transplant. She was sick with pulmonary hypertension for a very long time, for nearly a decade, and needed a transplant. And this is an ideal case to think about. If we could make her new lungs from her own genetic material, if she could donate to herself and grow her own lungs over a period of years and have those transplanted into herself, so there was a much lower risk of rejection, like, this would be absolutely amazing. So these are the kinds of scenarios that I was thinking about when I embarked on Regenerative Reliquary. A Regenerative Reliquary is bioprinted scaffolds for stem cell culture into bone. It's presented as a piece of artwork. It's shown in a bioreactor. And this piece was using the same kind of technology that was being used to make hip implants. And some of these hip implants had this trabecular bone structure applied to them. And I think they had to be recalled because what was happening was that the body's own stem cells were attaching to the trabecular structure and growing bone from there. So
Mhm.
we knew that this process would work, and there was some experimentation being done into making this kind of scaffolds to grow bone. So it's really interesting to think, what if we don't have to take a replacement from someone else or from a foreign source, and we can grow our own material? We can use the intelligence of how our body heals itself and make that replacement part. So it was Regenerative Reliquary was based off of that idea. And it was a very involved, very intense process in 2016. And still today, it's the largest known scaffold to be made for stem cell culture. This is where it's really interesting,
Wow.
artists and scientists working together, right? Because as a scientist, they're usually doing these projects on a really small scale in the lab, and like no one sees it for many, many years.
Mhm.
Like, even if it goes through FDA approval process and gets put into the body, like, you don't usually see that. But as an artist, I want something that was immediately recognizable as human. So I was thinking, like, all the bones in our bodies, what are some of the most recognizable? And a hand design is one of them.
Mhm.
So then I wanted to make something that was human scale. And this is very exceptionally difficult, because when we're thinking about processing a form that's roughly like the amount of, like, the same kind of structure that is in bones in a hand, like the amount of data and information that is to process that, we have to build up specialty computers. Then we have to send it to the printer, and that's very complex to get it to the printer. And then how do we ensure we have materials that don't time out over long printing processes? So this is an area that's very interesting to say, like, how the art pushes the science forward, but then also how the science informs the art. Like, I wouldn't have chosen this bright neon yellow color, but this was a color that was really important for the printing process and inherent in some of the B vitamins that were necessary to be in the structure. So the idea is that over time, the structure dissolves and only the bone remains. So stem cells are seeded onto the bone, or onto the scaffold, that are triggered to become tissue, and then grow to calcify into bone over time.
Wow. Where is this right now? Like, just in terms of, I'm just trying to place it
So
geographically.
there's a few different versions of this piece. There was pieces that were seeded with stem cells, grew, died. And then there's also archival versions as well for museums that can't support showing the living structures. There's some versions that grew and died, which is interesting in terms of like a relic or reliquary, this idea that I'm thinking about. I was really thinking about, I grew up Catholic, and I would go with my grandmother to shrines and see these like dead saints' parts, hands and bodies like encased. And they would be assigned with some kind of mystic agency, like they were seen to heal in some way. Often the agency was to heal. Sometimes it was for other reasons as well. But to me, that seemed really backwards, like the true mystery of life, the spiritual mystery outside of religions is like, where does life come from? So regenerative reliquary is flipping that script of dead relics and pointing to celebrating the life that's still a mystery. And also, this is important to me too, to point out at this time of rapid expansion, because many of these technologies are life-saving. They're absolutely incredible. They're profound. We also aren't thinking about how much this could absolutely change what it means to be human and change our evolutionary trajectory. So we have to be really cautious, even though these are amazing technologies that are life-enhancing, life-saving. We do have to be really cautious and have this reverence for it as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's really fascinating because, especially at this point in time where, we begin to see, whether it's prosthetics, and obviously there's this other entire new category of prosthetics in terms of, I believe the term is like, not performance enhancing is prosthetics, but in terms of prosthetics that actually provide additional function to the baseline function of a human being.
Mhm.
Um, and it's fascinating because I know one example is, for example, having a fifth digit that allows you to, for example, hold a spoon while you're also holding a
Mhm.
phone or something else like that. And these additional functionalities, it does really bring to mind at what point, as we push the lines between um, human and not human, where are we, who's objectively controlling that, and how do we define that? And I know we'll probably come back to talking about ethics a little bit around there too. Um,
Actually, I'd love
but
to um, speak to that a little bit.
yeah,
As we think about this realm, like you're mentioning bionics, implants, we also have neural implants, robotics, like implants that speak to external. We have this like 3D printing, bioprinting, wet AI, this overall like synthetic biology, genetic engineering, AI, machine learning, all of this in healthcare, this overall merging of infotech and biotech. Like, I think this is the really fundamental point, is that the concept of life itself has been expanded. Like, we are expanding. And so the way I look at this is much more like a pacemaker. A lot of people think that artificial intelligence is just about the technological, or it's something outside of ourselves. But to me, it's about the biological as well. And we're seeing that more and more as our biological and computer sciences are coming together. And they're coming together across all of these realms that, like, you started mentioning and that I was mentioning as well. And I'm looking at how we can use those to heal and enhance us. I mentioned a pacemaker. Like, this is a highly technological device that's implanted into someone. And it can even sometimes page the doctor, communicate with the doctor, notify a system if something is wrong. But when we look at someone with a pacemaker, we don't see them as a cyborg. We see it as someone whose life has been saved. So I want to kind of fundamentally like point out the framework that I'm coming from. Then also in that to look at how much are we actually changing, fundamentally changing our being as we're shifting and expanding what it means to be alive and what it means to be human. And there is a lot of ethical questions, but it's even beyond that. It's just like, what does it mean to show up in the world this way?
Yeah, would you be able to give some examples of areas where you've seen things kind of really going into um, pushing the limits around that in terms of asking that question of what is human, or where are things less obvious?
So I can give some examples of my artwork, like some of the artworks that I'm exploring with that. Um, I've been working on these biodigital organisms, and these are using AI as adaptive hybrid entities that start to blur the line between the organic and artificial. They evolve in lifelike beings in silico. They start to predict if how we can have, say, once in billion year events or bring together different situations. So this is where we're starting to use our our advanced technologies to plan out and project out what are these different kinds of outcomes, but then and actually practice in silico in the computational environment, but then bring them into the real world to affect very deep exponential changes that we couldn't undo. So when you look at that, like
Mm.
cross DNA and genetic modification, introducing new organisms, new species, this makes evolutionary changes. This changes the trajectory of our biosphere and,
Uh-huh.
in our future. And one of the projects I did was really interesting with the Smithsonian, and it was on de-extinction. They came to me and asked me to do a project with bones and ended up giving to me dinosaur bones. Now, usually I do work with humans, so I was like, well, what can I do with dinosaur bones? So I started looking at, well, what is this deep time that those bones represent? And how could we, through evolutionary machine learning, project from deep time into the far future, looking at if we made the slightest modifications, how would that actually change things? How would that change the trajectory, the evolutionary trajectory into the far future? So bringing that back to healthcare, when we look at how we're making these changes, we really need to try to consider how are these altering our bodies and beings. And I'd like to show and share the heart of evolution. So following regenerative reliquary, as an artist, one of the questions that I had or issues I had was that I want people to be able to see my work and in an instant get it, that they don't have to read a caption. The art just speaks for itself. Of course, if they want to learn more, that's great. One of the problems I was having though is how do I show when it's a living version? How do I show when it's an archival version? And I experimented with like putting in microscopes and different things, ways of looking at it. And I was also asking some of the fundamental philosophical questions about redesigning the body as well. And that's when I came up with the heart of evolution. And so this project is thinking about how, as we make modifications, we're changing who we are as individuals and as a species. And the heart represents across so many cultures, like this emotional seat of consciousness, right? The place of love and pain and joy. It represents humanity in a different way than some of our other vital organs. Like where the brain often represents thought, the heart represents this emotional state.
Mhm.
So I collaborated with cardiac surgeons and looked at how we can redesign vasculature through generative engineering and biofabrication. I made a few different versions, actually a number of different versions of this work. First in bioelastomers articulated by pacemakers. So this idea of like an advanced replacement heart. And then also looking at bioprinting as well. And again, if we can bioprint vasculature, this would have amazing, amazing benefits, not just for the heart, but just being another step closer to being able to make viable organs, viable replacement parts. This has a lot of medical benefits. As an artist, so there's a design element to that of redesigning the body. How can we better redesign the structure of the heart? Questions about, if we're making replacement parts, they don't need to look like our biological counterparts. They could be something new, something different. But as we're doing that, how are we changing who we are? what are the implications
Mhm.
across this emotional aspect? How does that change us? What are the implications across the spiritual aspect? I heard this story, and I think it might be kind of a famous story about a patient who got a transplant and was never a smoker. They got a bone marrow transplant. And after the transplant, they just wanted to smoke like nonstop. And the doctor said, well, that's probably because the person who you got the transplant from was a smoker. Yeah,
Interesting.
it's a crazy story. And when I was with my friend Lisa in the transplant house after she had her lung transplant in Philly, everyone I spoke to there from different cultures, from different religions, they all reported after they got their transplant that they could like feel something of the person that they got the
Wow.
transplant from. They couldn't quite articulate it. Some people were much more spiritual about it than others. But this is something that I'm thinking about as we're redesigning the body. Although this could be a
Uh-huh.
great medical benefit, like what are the other consequences that we have to consider?
Yeah. It reminds me of this movie, and I believe I've mentioned this in one of my previous podcast episodes as well. I'm not sure if you've heard of it. It's called Ship of Theseus.
No.
It's a movie by a director in India named Anand Gandhi, and it follows the Greek story of Ship of Theseus. And the premise of the story was, there was a ship that was at a dock in ancient times, and they were replacing pieces of wood to try to reconstitute the ship. And eventually, at one point in time, they'd replaced every single piece of wood from the original ship. And then, this individual asked, "Is this still the same ship or not?" At this point, and the Ship of Theseus, the movie, without giving too much away, explores that concept, except in the context of organ transplants in humans,
Oh,
uh,
amazing.
where a number of different individuals whose lives all kind of come together because various organs from the same individual had been transplanted to these different people, and there was a way in which they couldn't describe how they were all connected, which I think really speaks to what you're mentioning right now, and it also speaks to, I think, an area of science that is limited in the empirical model of science, which doesn't really account for things that we currently don't have mechanisms of being able to quantitatively measure. But intuitively and experientially, we know that there are these sort of connections. But yeah, it's a fascinating topic, and I do think it's going to be one of the areas that in the coming decades we're going to be seeing more of coming out of healthcare and technology.
I think it's also such a huge area of ethics and values as well. Because and this is something a point that is I think really important to bring up, to discuss is that a lot of these innovations are made with the intention to heal people, right? We want to heal people. Like we want to give people like my friend Lisa an opportunity, or I've worked with children with limb differences, 3D printing them prosthesis, or my uncle Dick, my great uncle Dick, who lost his leg in World War II and still bleeds every day. To be able to give those people, heal those people with a solution. Like this is how a lot of our advancements occur. This is the intention behind them. But then we have to also think of what are these unforeseen consequences. So first we will be giving these organs to people who are on the transplant list, very well deserving. Like we're going to be able to make replacement parts, very well needed. But then where do we cross the line? Before, when you were talking about like performance implants, performance enhancements, at what point are people then able to get these because they get old? Like right now, this is what I was talking about with like a full human lifespan. And who would be eligible for those? Like in America, it'd probably be more accessible to the wealthy. In other countries, it might be like another metric of who would be more deserving. What value do they
Mhm.
bring to society? Different cultures have different values in this way. So who would be able to get these transplants and for what reason? Like where's the line of
Yeah.
who has the accessibility or not? And also how do we say no to those things too? What if somebody doesn't want to live? What are the rights to live and to die in these kinds of spaces too? What are all the questions we
Yeah.
ask about that?
There's an interesting thought experiment as well, which is, along that line of thinking around the fact that many of these additions, these enhancements may have expiry dates associated with them. And, let's say somebody has an extra arm or some other functional enhancement. At the loss of that enhancement, that they then feel a loss of their own humanity, even though it may not have been something is, initially considered
Mhm.
part of a normal human functioning. So in that sense, yeah, does this kind of touch on the elasticity that the definition of humanity itself has? It has more to do with what we define as the boundaries of our body, and can we begin to much more deeply consider some of these things as deeper extensions of our body? And we all feel that to one extent or another when we don't have our phones. You do feel like you've lost a part of yourself, which is ironic, as this is far from the human organ. So, I mean, this conversation wouldn't be complete if we didn't talk about AI and where this intersects with healthcare. And in one of our previous conversations, you spoke to the fact that you've been intersecting with this space in particular for quite some time. I'd love to hear a little bit about your thoughts, your observations, over the last 5, 10 years in this space.
So I've been in AI since about 2015. I got into it through generative design, through doing this kind of work in the medical field, looking at how we can replicate the body. Growing up in the lab with my mom, I used to be pipetting all the time, like in these flat petri dishes. And that's essentially what bioprinting is, right? It's like building up these layers and layers and layers. But the body works in 3D. Like our internal environment works in 3D. Doing things flat on a petri dish doesn't mimic as well the life forces that are put upon our structures in the body. And at previous points in history, it was pretty much impossible to be able to reconstruct this kind of detail and mimic what is happening on the microscopic level in the body, to be able to mimic that, to make a structure that can allow cells to grow, allow the body to be able to like make something to heal itself. So this was my line in. This was what I was really excited about. And then of course being able to see all of the potentials with AI to be able to predict things that we couldn't see before, like protein folding. Absolutely amazing, mind-blowing. I'm so thankful to be alive at this moment in history when we've had all of these consistent evolutions, and AI is such a big part of this. I fundamentally believe, and I mentioned this a little bit earlier, that AI is not just about the technological, but it's about the biological as well. And we are just seeing this more and more as our infotech and our biotech merges and comes together. And I think that's something that if you work in the field, you get that, but a lot of the general public still doesn't understand that it is influencing us. AI is influencing us on so many levels. It's fundamentally changing our bodies, our minds, our beings. We're touching it in if you live in contemporary modern society, if you use phones, if you use computers, AI is inherent in almost everything that we do every day, and it is affecting us, it's influencing us. So I try to think of it as a child, and I like this analogy. I have 3 young children, and it's like, what am I doing in front of my children? What am I teaching them? AI is
Yeah.
always listening to us. It is always watching us, and it's
Yeah.
watching us when we're doing stuff we wouldn't want our kids to see. Are we being mindful that we are training it in the way that we want it to grow? And when we see it doing something that we don't like, are we saying we're not going to use it that way? We're not going to do it that way. Are we I think it's fundamentally important with and you see this in my art projects too, that when I'm using a new emerging or exponential technology, including AI, but not limited to AI, to say, what can we use this for to be able to do something we've never been able to do before? And in this field, that means how can we heal and enhance our bodies? How can we heal and enhance humanity in a way that was never possible before? What can we discover that we couldn't do before? What can we unlock using these tools? And in that is just like immense, incredible potential that even where we're at right now, I wouldn't be able to exhaust in my lifetime. So it's just so exciting. Like every day I am thankful to be living in this era of generative AI. I really am. And I'm
I-
also very concerned as well. And so like in this, I'm talking about these amazing opportunities, but there's also like so many pitfalls and dangers too. And we cannot be blind to that, even when our goal is for this good and healing purposes.
Absolutely. Again, it's one of the things that drives me to do what I'm doing with my work with Nimble, which is really focused around this idea of how do we take the right course in developing relationships between humans and generative AI based entities, if you will. And I think that in in so many ways, generative AI in particular is such a reflection of
Mhm.
humanity in its current state. And obviously, at many times, it's we don't like what
You're,
we see.
Mhm.
But it is that mirror in that context. And rather than trying to fix the AI, we often have to think about whether there's things societally that we need to address that fixing the AI is not really going to solve. Um, so one of the things I wanted to talk about as well as an extension of AI and this conversation around why technology is important and exploration is important in the context of the human experience. I recently saw that you posted about the fact that some of your artwork has landed on the moon or will be landing on the moon. Is that correct?
Yes. Yeah. I have a number of pieces across 2 missions. So in January and February of 2025, first 2 months of
Eh,
the year, two major
Congratulations.
launches. Thank you. Thank you.
And yeah, so it really made me think about the fact that on one hand, we can really think of this as being okay. Well, what does this really have to do with health and humanity? But I wanted to pose that question to you. You had this recent project, Echoes from the Valley of Existence. And to you, where does space exploration intersect with both health and humanity?
So I can tell you a little bit about my projects, but big picture, I really see space as one of the incubators, not the only one, but one of the incubators for a next phase of existence. Really, I thinking about the boundaries of life, intelligence, what it means to be human, what it means to be alive. These are all the questions that I ask, really thinking about what is the nature of intelligence? What is intelligence when our biointelligence, like our DNA, comes together with our artificial and machine technological intelligence, comes together with other intelligences. So in going into space, there's a few different functions. The one is that it could be backup for Earth, right? There could be something that happens here, and we want to make some off planet backups. So that's one way of looking at this. So simply leaving something and saving it on the moon, for example, is like saving something for future finders, most likely future humans or even a next generation. It could last long enough with some of the materials that we're using, like Corning Billionaire ceramics or synthetic amber in encasing DNA. I'll tell you more about the projects in a minute since I'm hinting at them now. We could potentially hold information on the moon and in space in certain environments to be a backup for future generations and or the next after humans, whatever that may be. And I think of that more as like when humans opened King Tut's tomb. This had a lot of information about humans, but they had all of this different information and knowledge. Some of their mathematics and understanding and engagement with the physical world far still surpasses what we know now. So we learned so much from that. Also, in opening that tomb, though, a lot of people got sick. Some people died. You know, the curse of King Tut's tomb. If
And
we if we were going to be sending things and saving things for the future, what is important to save? What is important to share? You know, the most intelligent things we can share are DNA, like our code of life, in my opinion, right? The biological materials. But we also have a number of advancements at this point we're at in humanity and society as well that might be interesting for future humans or other finders as well. So that's one reason that I'm motivated and interested to send things to space. The constraints are really extreme in space. There's limited resources, there's high radiation exposure, there's the need for self-sustaining systems. So
Hmm.
the innovations and the thoughts that we develop for space exploration have a lot of also connection with healthcare, from bioengineered tissues to AI-driven diagnostics. And this can also revolutionize healthcare on Earth, or help us to think about things differently on Earth when we have this kind of extreme constraints with limited resources. If we can create autonomous, intelligent, self-sustaining healthcare systems for deep space missions or ways of communicating back and forth, why can't we apply these same kinds of thinkings to remote areas on Earth where it will be actually easier than in space, right? How can we design healthcare for extreme environments that also benefit people who lack access to traditional medical systems? Like, what are we learning from doing this work that we can apply here and now? Both across like very typical, practical, technical healthcare, and then also across like the long-term thinking and how we're going to grow.
Oh, it's fascinating, and I totally get that. In doing so, you're also distilling what parts of the things that we're trying to do are most important, right? So it's a forced exercise, and in one way to be able to say which of these things do we want to preserve? What is the fundamental essence of what we're trying to do? If someone's in space, what are the basic things we need to be able
Cool.
to provide them?
Yes. Um, Echoes from the Valley of Existence is an interactive, adaptive, and responsive environment that considers the ways that we live outside of our bodies. This was a piece that I was commissioned to do for the Triennale in Sapporo, Japan. And they came to me and they said, "We want you to think about the future of death life." And what a beautiful prompt to make an artwork. So I thought about the traces that we leave behind and the stories that they'll tell about us in the future. So, of course, we have our physical remains. And something that's very interesting is our DNA remains. Like, what story does that tell about who we are? And we're now in this era of having also these digital and biodigital echoes of us as well, like all of our healthcare records, people who have had their genome sequenced, the biometrics that we give every time we're in the airport and they scan our faces, or fingerprint biometrics. There's that kind of stories from us. And then there's all this like huge amount of data we're generating on a daily basis, our images, our texts. How will these echo through time and space and tell a story about us?
Hmm.
This artwork, it was an immersive installation and it was interactive. And the front, actually, it also engaged some quantum technologies as well, and quantum thinking of like in the future too, when we go into a phase of right now, how reliant we are on our digital systems and how much that's transformed us when we go into a quantum future, which we're already seeing quantum technologies applied in healthcare quite a bit. How will that change our bodies? How will that change us as well? So there's an element of that in the piece as well, including some research that was done at Stanford University on the cymatics of heart cells, and that made the foundational information for the sound of this piece. And so in this piece, the artwork reflected a quantum twin of a person. And then also, and that was more conceptual. And then it also reflected a digital twin through real-time body tracking and biometrics and the mirroring of a person. And these were all also modified by current environmental conditions. So just like we are changing with our environment all the time, the image of us, the capture of us was changing. And I made this really beautiful installation, but it just felt like it wasn't enough. Like, people can go in, they can engage with this, but we're doing this all the time. And we're not really thinking about how is this left for the future. So as part of this piece, I gave visitors the opportunity to leave messages, photos, and DNA for the future in an ensemble of imagery, text, and DNA that would be then launched into space and put on the moon. It is now on the moon. This piece opened at the beginning of 2024 and it launched at the beginning of 2025. And so, to me, a really interesting part of this piece is, would you leave a message or your picture or DNA, and why or why not? And if you would just leave your DNA and not a message, why? Or if you would just leave a message and not your DNA, why? So I'd be curious to ask you, like, would you leave your DNA? Why or why not?
It's a really good question. My immediate response would be my immediate, I guess, non-rational response would be probably not. Um, and only because, and for the same reasons I've had hesitancy to, for example, do something like 23andMe and other services, where there's a sense of DNA being the last frontier of privacy. At
Mhm.
least conceptually for me, on the rational perspective, my DNA is could actively be accessed from so many different points, whether it's from a haircut or a blood test result from somewhere else.
Mhm.
So I feel like, rationally speaking, it probably already, can be mined and accessed in other ways. So if I remove that concern, um, then yeah, I don't know. I feel like I'd have to think more deeply about whether or not I'd want to intentionally put that forward. How do you answer that? How did you answer that question? And I guess was your DNA involved
So
in this particular
I
project?
I am in the same school of thought as you of like I never wanted to have my DNA sequence commercially. I have had it done privately through UCSF here in the Bay Area. So I do have my entire sequence. And I am open to contributing to medical studies like for aplasia
Yeah.
cutis, where, I'm anonymous, but they're looking at that certain element. I wanted to be in control of that.
Yeah.
And I also always was super curious, who am I related to? And like, what's
Yeah.
my background? All of that.
Yes. Yeah.
But but I would never participate commercially either. So in this case, I was coming from that situation of like, what would I be comfortable with and why am I asking these questions? And it's like really truly posing this question for this unknown future of how could this be used in the future? It's not to be sequenced now. And it wasn't sequenced. So over 37 days of this exhibition being open, 5,600 people chose to leave their DNA. And this went together in a vat, like they swabbed their cheek and then they could just basically put it in a vat. Everyone's DNA was together, brought down to a powder and then encased in a synthetic amber. So it is truly like saved for the future. And this makes a
Oh,
really interesting question about legacy then, right? It's
mhm.
not about like, how could that be used now? Or like commercially. Now, maybe it will be used commercially in some crazy way, but we won't be able to foresee what that is. Just like how we were talking about King Tut's too. We don't know how the mummies were buried with veneration. And there was a certain period of time that they were used for like high-end parties. We can't foresee how our remains will be used in the future. But this is part of what I'm trying to encourage people to think about now as we're leaving all of these remnants of us. DNA being just one of them, but our messages, our photos, everything we're leaving of us, how is this going to be telling a story about us and how is it going to affect the future? Like, what if the DNA is opened and we can do things like this is actually packaged with a larger project that I'll talk about next, and it includes a seed bank. Like, what if people in the future could taste apples that had been extinct for so long? It's so
Uh,
amazing. Or what if we lost something in our sequence is vitally important, but then also what if they reopened it and it reopened COVID? Like somebody had COVID when they were giving
uh,
it the King Tut's tomb. So these are the kinds of questions I'm asking. And the difficulty with this space art is as opposed to like Bioart in a museum. In a museum, if there's something living, it's through like 3 layers of glass. It's not going to hurt anyone. It's not actually going into somebody's body. It's painting this picture of a speculative future to try to get us to think about it. If there is something in, say, the materials development or bioprinting or the process that could be used eventually in healthcare to heal people, that is an amazing best case scenario. But it's not something that's directly where I'm making a piece of artwork and it's going to affect somebody right then or
yeah.
be implanted into their body. But with the space work, this is being sent there and we really don't know what's going to happen in the future with it. We have no
Yeah.
idea. And there's so much responsibility with that.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, you're adding an entirely different dimension to the conversation. and both from the perspective of ethics in terms of what are we doing with this and what is the intent of this, but also does this accurately reflect humanity, right? How is this perceived if it's received on the other end, or what's received by people in a certain time in the future? What does it say about us today? So there's a lot to feel there.
Are they gonna think we're like 97% Japanese because this was shown in a remote part of Japan in the winter, like where not a lot of travelers were coming? So this project, Echoes from the Valley of Existence, is packaged in with a much larger project because there was also some of these bigger concerns. So from this project, the part of this project that's sending the DNA and the images and text to the moon was sponsored by LifeShip. I had come across this company in a forum that I was in MIT during the pandemic, maybe 5 years ago or so. LifeShip was a company that was sending DNA and messages to the moon. And I remember we talked about at the
Yeah.
time, like maybe is there a project they were interested in me doing something for them and it wasn't a fit. But when I was doing this project, Echoes from the Valley of Existence, I remembered them and I called them up and I was like,
Mhm.
hey, will you sponsor this work? And they were just like, yeah, sure. This is a great project. This is exactly like what we're thinking of. And it was a nice fit. So out of this project, then I was invited to do the artwork for a project that they were organizing. And this is a new version of the golden records. In 1977, NASA sent up a compilation of 2 records into deep space. They're still hurtling through deep space. They're like this message in a bottle cast into the cosmic ocean, hoping that like someone, somewhere, something, some form might find it someday. And they're like actual phonographic records that captures what was the best of humanity at that time. And it's now almost 50 years later. So there's a new version. And the question is like 50 years, all the developments we've had, what would be important to include in this? So I was invited as an artist and a partner on that project. So an artist to make the cover art, but then also to ask about these deeper questions and help inform the larger work. So Echoes from the Valley of Existence is packaged in with that, but in with the Golden Archive, this includes DNA, which is really interesting from not just humans, but also many species, animals and plant species. It also includes an AI LLM. It includes repositories and like of knowledge of all this information of our advancements in math and science, literature from all over the world, many different cultures. Interstellar Foundation, which collects and makes a beautiful messages from humanity is included on there. There's a number of amazing partners that do this very thoughtful work, and it's all packaged together on this billion-year material. And it was sent to space. One version is in the moon, and then one version is gonna hitch a ride on an asteroid in 2026 and go into deep space. So the moon one is interesting. The deep space one is even crazier, in my opinion, because one theory of how Earth got started was that an asteroid crashed here that had the right condition, like had the right genetic material. And so what
Yeah.
if what we're making now can like potentially spawn life or wreak havoc on an ecosystem? Like we have no idea. And they're
Yeah.
billion year materials. So we can't even like as advanced as our technologies are, there we can't predict out into that future.
Yeah. Wow. That's incredible. Lots to think about there. I'm cognizant of
Yes.
time, and I like to make sure that we have an opportunity to share some of your thoughts. If you had an audience of people working in healthcare, leaders in the healthcare system, and you wanted to inspire them, what words would you have to say with respect to how to think about the future and how to think perhaps a little bit differently about the experience of health and humanity?
I have a lot of friends in healthcare, also, a lot of collectors as well. And I talk to the the doctors and my friends, my collaborators, my collectors often about, where are they? And I think a lot of us have, I know a lot of us have this shared passion. We got into the field we're in because we want to heal people. We want to make a better future. And I'm doing it in my own way through art. People in the medical field are directly doing it on a daily basis. And unfortunately, a lot of the systems that are in place have disconnected us from being able to successfully do our job or to smoothly do our job. And so a lot of our work is in how do we get back to doing what we feel like is the true value, purpose, and meaning in what we're doing. And that's in supporting healing, actually creating systems that are supporting healing. A lot of healthcare needs a systemic rehaul. The insurance system, like we know that. And it's not just about implementing new technology, it's about how we use that technology and continuing to come back to creating systems that support healing, patient-centered care. We're moving further and further away from the human connection in medicine and human connection in general. Like, I talk to my doctor friends, they used to have their hands on people, they used to touch people. And now they have to, like, turn their back or turn their side while they're on their computer taking notes the whole time. My friends that were sculptors always used to touch clay, and musicians used to touch instruments. All of us, we are being taken off of touching, and we're being taken off of that kind of intelligence and knowing through those means and being homogenized down a path of thinking on a computer. Now, technology definitely has a role, and I've talked about the amazing parts that technology has that role. AI and automation can be incredibly valuable, but they can't replace genuine care, genuine connection with patients, with people, with when it needs to be like touching humans, hands-on care, the compassion connection, the emotional connection. And I think we all really need to fight for a system that prioritizes presence, compassion, building that care, building that trust wherever you are in the healthcare system. It's not just for providers, but it's for patients too. It's for all of us. Like, how do we make the space and find the way to connect that and have the technology support it instead of the technology become the main focus that overrides it?
Absolutely. I think bringing it back to the things that we're losing in essence is crucial, and I think all this really goes back to also thinking about how we train healthcare providers today, how we build systems, how we redesign hospitals, how we rethink about the way things get paid for. I'm optimistic that given that we're hopefully going to be unshackling ourselves from the limitations in diagnostic reasoning and clinical capabilities, and we scale intelligence, it'll give us more room to be able to renegotiate those other pieces and to bring things back to what matters.
Yes.
Uh,
And I
but-
would like to take a moment too to advocate at this point too for that patients that we need to have the ethics and transparency. Patients and practitioners alike, we need to understand and know clearly when AI is involved in the care and involved in the pipeline, involved in the system. We should always have the ability to opt in or at a minimum opt out. But right
yeah,
now, I don't feel like, and when I look at the transactions that I've had over the past year and a half, I couldn't honestly give informed consent to any one of those transactions because of the technologies that are used in the pipeline and the lack of the ability to even tell me what was used in making my healthcare decisions. We're seeing that more and more, and I think this is like a area that we have to be aware of. And I think with the awareness comes the ability to improve the system.
absolutely. I think that's foundationally important and highlights the fact that there's a lot of work to do still. I
Yes.
feel like all of us need to be kept quite busy for the next little while. So Amy, any final words that you wanted to share? Anything you wanted to share with the audience?
The future of healthcare to me isn't just about the technology, it's about how we integrate the advancements in a way that serves humanity, serves our health, serves our well-being. If we lose sight of the patient or the reason that we got into these fields, the person healing us, like making a better future, genuine healthcare and healing, then we've really lost our way. But we can use these technologies to help support us and heal us in ways that were never possible before. So let's keep this in the appropriate relationship and in the right framework of using technology to support and enhance the healthcare in our medical system instead of replace it.
Thank you, Amy, for sharing those words. And thank you for sharing what I really feel is it's been an expansive conversation. I feel like we covered a lot of ground in a relatively short period of time. And I know we've only just scratched the surface of the work that you're doing. I really appreciate you taking the time to share your thoughts and your work with an audience that quite frankly, I feel like doesn't often get the opportunity to be inspired, to be given hope and optimism. And I really hope to be able to continue this conversation again one day.
Likewise.